Set against the shores of Lake Erie and home to a menagerie of amusement parks, Sandusky, Ohio makes for a popular tourist's playground. But for 26-year-old Sandusky native and single mother of two, Carrie Caudle, life itself is a constant juggling act.
At that time, my kids were 6 and 11 months old. So I'm working and taking care of them, play with the kids and cook dinner and bathe them, put them to bed, get up, go to work again.
She was the sole provider of the children, so she had to work all the time to pay the bills.
Hey, you need to head out, right?
Yeah, my next shift starts at 6.
Go ahead, I'll take care of Courtney.
Carrie's best friend was my girlfriend at that time. She lived across the hall from us. Me or Jim was there to take care of the kids.
Go, we've got this covered.
And Michael's okay?
Yes, he's watching TV with Brian and could not be happier.
Okay. Thank you, you're a lifesaver.
Mwah. No problem.
See ya.
See ya.
To make ends meet, Carrie divides her time between a fast food restaurant and a convenience store.
Hi there.
Oh, hello.
If you need anything, just let me know.
Actually, there is something I need.
What's that?
Well, I'm trying to decide what to buy, salty or sweet.
It's really up to you.
You work here all alone?
Mostly. I don't mind the quiet, to be honest.
Do you ever get scared?
Hi there. If you need anything, just let me know.
Guess I'll see you around then.
You always got weird people or rude guests, but, you know, I just blew them off.
Hello? 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 Okay.
In Sandusky, there was some violent crime, but it's not an everyday thing. Burglaries generally, robberies, and a homicide once in a great while.
By the time Carrie arrives home from work, it's well past midnight, and Carrie is not as alone as she seems.
God, you jerk!
Oh my gosh, sorry, I didn't mean to scare you like that.
My brother and I were super close. He worked 2 jobs himself, so he was always working too.
No, it's fine. It's just weirdest thing happened at work tonight, and it's nothing. Just forget it. It's nothing. All right, you go first.
Me?
Yes, you. I want to keep an eye on you.
She used to close some nights, but I really didn't worry about her too much back then. We never really had stuff that happened here like what happened to her until that happened, really.
While 2 kids and 2 jobs doesn't leave Carrie with much time for a social life, it doesn't mean she goes unnoticed.
Big mess, huh? Some little kid spilled his pop.
That's okay. I'm used to cleaning up after kids.
You don't remember me, do you?
I'm sorry. Should I?
Guess not. I just wanted to see if you ever have a night off. Maybe we could go out. I know you work here and over at the convenience store, but I just thought that
How do you know I work there?
Well, I just saw you there the other day. You probably see lots of guys like me.
I'm sorry. I can't. I have just.
You know what? Never mind. I'll see you around.
Did I have guys ask me out, hit on me? Yeah. I had 2 young kids to take care of, and I worked so much, I wasn't worried about that.
As Carrie remains immersed in life's everyday demands, disturbing news is brought to her attention.
Is that your stuff in the washer over there?
Yeah, just give me a minute. I'll move it over.
It's okay. It's just, I wanted to warn you.
Warn me, about what?
Somebody's been stealing underwear from here. Ladies' underwear.
At that point, we had a few burglaries, break-in enterings. Someone who was going into these women's residences and taking their lingerie.
Thanks for the warning. It's weird, but
Just be careful, okay?
At that time, you hear about some break-ins and stuff.
During encounters, Carrie remains unaware of the danger she's in.
Hey, dinner's ready. Jen's gonna bring the kids over in a few minutes.
I was just about to make something.
That? What the heck is even in there?
I don't want you buying dinner for us. Seriously. God, you and Jen do enough already.
Yeah, well, I didn't buy this. Somebody had ordered it and then didn't have the money to pay for it, so it's a leftover.
You think I believe that?
Seriously, you don't owe me anything.
Come on. I'm not gonna take charity.
It's not charity, it's pizza. Besides, I don't want your money.
Whatever. Here.
Seriously, I don't want your money. Besides, no one pays for pizza with a check, Carrie.
Fine, whatever.
We were at each other's houses all the time. My brother would always be just walking in my door.
Okay, kids are asleep. You guys didn't have to clean up.
Oh, yes, we did. All right, enjoy that glass of wine. We are gonna head home.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Love you.
Love you too. Night, sis.
I know there's some evil people around, but we had no idea somebody was watching her. This man was fixated on my sister. He was stalking her. And he was a sick individual.
Single mother Carrie Cottle's main focus in life is her children.
Great job! Woo! I've got to go in for a minute and make sure Aunt Jen's okay with the baby, okay? I'll be right back. Mwah.
What she can't see is that someone else is focused on her.
She didn't know he was following her. I mean, it could happen to anybody, I feel. You don't know who's watching you.
Michael! 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 Ah, you scared me. Hey, let's go inside. It's almost dinner time, okay?
I almost lost a ball.
Okay, honey, let's go inside, okay?
He was going into her job, following her around town and stuff like that. But we didn't find this out until later.
And unbeknownst to Carrie, an innocent girl's night out will descend into hell.
Jen and I, we might have went out once every 2-3 months. And the day this happened, I had went to a wedding, and I actually had the next day off from both jobs, which was very rare. So we went to a bar.
That is strong.
Good, because we are gonna have some fun tonight.
I told you I am just staying for one drink. Seriously.
Okay, Carrie. Yeah, one drink, sure. I think all of my best stories started with one drink.
I'm sure they did. Here's to old friends.
Oh, cheers to that.
You're trying to kill me.
The kids was with the babysitter downstairs. I was working. Jen and Carrie were supposed to call me when they got done. I was going to go pick them up.
As the night wears on, someone at the bar spies Carrie from across the room.
Carrie? Carrie Caudill, that you?
Yes.
It's Alex. Alex Parks from high school? I haven't seen you in years.
Alex, of course.
An ex-boyfriend of mine was at the bar ordering drinks, and he stopped me, and I talked to him because even though he was an ex-boyfriend, he was also the best friend of my cousin, so he still was a friend.
Yeah. So how you been?
I'm okay. Just working a lot. Had a couple kids.
Couple? Wow.
Yeah, 2.
You got some photos you can show me?
No.
Come on, don't be shy. I haven't seen you. I want to see your kids. Show me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Michael and Courtney.
Oh, they're cuties. See where they get their good looks from.
Yeah, why don't you see where you can get another beer from, Alex?
Hey, Jen. It's good to see not much has changed with you. Okay.
Yeah, see you around.
Okey-dokey.
Oh my God, that guy's too much. You're telling me. Oh my gosh. Thank you for saving me.
Hey, that's my boyfriend, you know?
Oh, okay. Hi. We're just old friends.
Stay away from him or else.
Okay,
You won't talk to him anymore.
I'm serious. Or else.
Okay. All right, that's cool. We're good. We've had enough now.
No, I have not had enough.
His girlfriend was mad that I had showed him pictures of my kids and said I shouldn't have done that. I mean, it was just two little kids' pictures. I mean, I didn't see nothing wrong with it.
You need to calm down.
It's not okay.
Calm down.
Okay.
Just
back off.
Don't relax.
Get her out of
She
here.
went to hit me, but she hit Jen. It was so fast, so Jen didn't get to hit her back. They broke it up quick.
Hey, it's fine.
And we just went over and sat down.
You know, this was supposed to be a girl's night, for God's sake.
I'm so sorry. Are you sure you're okay?
Yeah.
Can I get you anything?
No, you know what? I'm good. I'm good.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom real quick, okay? I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said, well, I'm gonna go to the bathroom before Brian gets here. But I actually left. Jen didn't know. I didn't know if that girlfriend was gonna try to come over and start something again. And I just didn't want that. I just thought if I left, then I would keep her from maybe coming up and starting another fight again. It was probably about 10 o'clock at night. The plan was I was on a walk home. I've walked the streets at night before. I always thought it was such a safe place. But for some reason, on the way home, I stopped and called the babysitter from a payphone.
Hey, it's me. I'm on the way home. Are the kids okay?
Courtney and Michael are sound asleep, Miss Gatto.
Great. I should be home in 10, but if I'm not, call the police, okay?
The police?
Yeah, the police. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't know, just, I'll be home in 10, okay?
And she said, okay, but she was half asleep, I think. I have no idea why I did that. Something made me just call her. I have no rhyme or reason why.
But as Carrie makes her way home, someone else isn't far behind her.
All of a sudden, I heard footsteps. And then, boom, he's like right behind me out of nowhere, like he dropped out of the sky. And I let him pass me, and he just walked past me. And then once we got right to where that alley was, he turned around.
Hey, aren't you the girl who got into a fight in the club a little bit ago?
I didn't know who this man was. He had a very distinctive jacket on. His eyes, just something about his eyes, they make me shiver to the bone.
I don't want to talk about it.
I went to walk past him, and that's when he grabbed me. And pulled me into the alley. He was ripping off my pantyhose and was trying to bound my hands and feet together with the pantyhose. I was fighting him hard. And then he just left me there.
No! Someone!
I was thinking, why is this happening? Why me? What am I gonna do? How am I gonna get out of this?
Help me, please! Help! Help, please! Hey! Hello! Please help me, please!
And then all of a sudden, he appeared with his car, and I knew I was never going home.
No, no, no!
On her way home from a bar, Carrie Cottle is ambushed and attacked out of nowhere by a complete stranger. But to her horror, her attacker is the only one who answers her cries for help.
Why don't you get in my car? I'll take you to the hospital.
He was acting like he hadn't done anything and he was going to get me help. I think he did that because he thought I would come willingly and wouldn't keep fighting, but I kept fighting.
Go away, go away, go away!
Now, where do you think you're going, honey? Huh? Where do you think you're going? Come on.
I was only 2 blocks from my mother's house. I was trying to get loose, trying to fight him off, and I was yelling for help, but nobody heard me. As soon as I fell into the car, I reached over and hit the horn. Once he shut the door, I knew there was no getting loose.
Where'd you go and do that? Listen to me. You live in an apartment on Monroe Boulevard. I know you can either cut the crap, or I can be that little boy of yours in other places. Maybe we could play catch in that front yard of yours again.
He told me I needed to stop fighting and do what he says because he knew where my kids' babysitter was and that he would kill my kids. To hear that, then I did quit fighting because the first instinct is to save my kids.
Back at the bar, Carrie's friend Jen is starting to wonder where she is.
After Carrie went to the bathroom, Jen thought I was where she wasn't back yet.
Harry? Harry?
So then Jen called me to come pick her up and told me that my sister just took off from the bar. That's when me and Jen took off going looking for her.
Despite everything he's already put her through, Carrie's attacker is just getting started.
The assailant drove Carrie to his house. It's a fairly rural area on a dead-end road. I don't know if he carried her into the house, but there may not have been anybody that was even awake to see what went on.
Keep your head down. Keep your head down. Get in there. Just get in there. Get down. I said get down.
Please help! Please help!
At this point, I'm thinking, what is this man gonna do to me?
Just shut up! Please stop!
Said shut up!
I don't know that he had a plan when the evening started, but at some point he formulated this plan to sexually assault and torture her, and he carried it out.
What I did wrong? Why are you doing this?
Doing this?
Please, please.
started beating me.
No, I told you to shut up! Shut up!
And then after he beat me, he raped me. And then he beat me some more. Then he raped me some more. He was beating me so much I was going in and out of consciousness. It felt like an eternity. And then he would just stop and he'd just stand there thinking, what can I do next?
She was fighting to live for her children. Those were her kids. She was going to raise them. So I think during that time, that's what kept her motivated to stay alive.
As Carrie endures unspeakable acts of violence, her brother Brian and his girlfriend Jen continue their search for her.
Carrie! Carrie!
I'm telling you, she's not out here. Looked everywhere she could be.
Well, then where is she?
It was very frustrating driving around looking for her, knowing she should have been home. Jen was calling while I was driving, kept calling her house, she wasn't home.
I don't know. I think we should make some more calls. Look, I feel really bad, and
She's fine. Hey, she's fine. She's gotta be. Okay?
I was worried, but I was more frustrated because I couldn't find her when I should have been able to find her. She like disappeared off the face of the earth.
Please stop!
He burned Carrie with a soldering gun. She had been burnt and tortured with that soldering gun sexually.
Stop screaming!
He said, you better stop screaming or I'm gonna kill you.
I said stop!
So I was trying not to scream and I passed out again.
When the sexual assault was completed, he then manually strangled her.
So I just went limp. So he stopped strangling me and he felt for my pulse on my neck and he didn't get one. So he thought he had killed me.
Hours after being abducted by a stranger, Carrie Cottle has been raped, beaten, and strangled within an inch of her life.
I was like, I've got to play dead, otherwise I'm not going to survive. After that, then he started to cut all the ropes and blindfolded me, but I did not open my eyes whatsoever. It's like, you got to be kidding me. I'm laying here and he really just took a picture. It's like, what kind of sick freak is he? When it flashed, it was like, oh, did I jump? Did I move? Did I twitch? And after that, he picked me up like a rag doll and just threw me over his shoulder, and then took me out and threw me in the back of his car.
As she continues to play dead, Carrie's attacker makes his next move.
And then he took me and just threw me on the ground. And just left me. I laid there and I laid there and I laid there. I was so scared to get up. I didn't know once I did get up if he was gonna be waiting there. But it was like somebody told me it was okay to get up and go. So I got up and ran. I ran to the first house I could get to.
Anybody in there?
And beat on the door till they finally came. The whole time I'm standing out there, I'm thinking he's gonna drive by and see me on the porch and know I'm alive, and he's gonna come after me again. I told him I had been kidnapped and raped, had no idea where I was. And I just kept saying, gotta send an officer to my house. He knows where my kids are.
Police and paramedics arrive at the scene, and Carrie is transported to a nearby hospital.
Miss Caudill? I'm Officer Batson with the Sandusky Police Department. I know you've been through a lot, but I was just wondering if I could ask you some questions. Do you think you could tell me about your attacker?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Anything that you can remember can help us find him.
He looked kind of average. White, about 6 feet tall.
You can take your time.
I can tell you about the car he was driving.
That's great.
She was very specific. Loud exhaust on the car, manual transmission, that he had been wearing a distinctive jacket. She knew she was in a trailer because of the sound on the floor. It kind of had a hollow sound.
With Carrie's description of her attacker in hand, police head to the bar where it all began to look for clues. And Carrie's family learns the horrific details of what happened to her the night before.
Carrie.
Gut-wrenching. Someone had done all that stuff to my sister. It's just unbelievable.
I'll be fine.
looking for you.
This is your fault.
Everybody wanted to hug me, but nobody could touch me. My body was a crime scene.
But that afternoon, as Carrie is discharged from the hospital, police return with good news. The manager of the bar has identified a potential suspect.
Based on the distinctive design of the jacket that the assailant was known to be wearing, we asked, hey, who in the bar last night was wearing a jacket like this? And the bar manager identified Mr. Taylor.
Carrie?
Yes.
We have identified a person of interest, but we need more information just to be sure.
Larry Taylor had a lengthy criminal history before this attack on Carrie. He'd also been implicated in a number of attacks on women where he would sneak up behind them or otherwise assault them. And in fact, Mr. Taylor drove a silver car with a loud exhaust with a manual transmission. Police thought maybe by taking her out to where Mr. Taylor was known to live, that maybe that would help jar her memory.
Do you want me to go back there?
I understand if you're not up to it. We don't want to push you, but Larry Taylor is a strong suspect. And if we can confirm that he brought you to his residence last night, things can move very quickly.
I need a minute.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Great. I'll let them know.
Accompanied by police, Carrie is driven to Groton Township, a rural area almost 10 miles south of Sandusky.
Miss Caudill, thank you for agreeing to help us today. I'm Detective Sixman. What do you think?
It was dark, but I think this is it. It seems right.
And then this car turned onto the road, and I knew it was him before I even heard him say, "There he is." He looked right at me. I was real scared. I was shaking. He knows I'm alive, for real.
What's going on here?
Are you Larry Taylor?
Yeah, that's me.
Your name came up in connection with an active investigation.
What kind of investigation?
Can't talk about the details at this point, Mr. Taylor. But would you mind if we search your trailer?
Search all you want. I haven't got anything to hide.
Great. Stay with your car, please.
Mr. Taylor initially, when we spoke with him, was calm, businesslike, didn't give us any indication that he knew anything about what we were there for. He signed a waiver of search and allowed us to go inside.
When detectives enter Larry Taylor's home, evidence of his perverse depravity is on full display.
One of the first things I remember that caught my eye were there were upper portions of mannequins and garbage bags full of what turned out to be women's underwear.
Detective! There's a lot more in there.
All right. Keep looking.
Yes, sir.
On our initial search of Mr. Taylor's residence, we'd also found Xerox copies of driver's licenses that had been enlarged, and they were of women. Now, I knew one of the women whose driver's license was blown up. I knew that she had reported a burglary where she believed her lingerie had been tampered with or stolen from her house. We had a number of issues that were going to have to be investigated further.
Officer?
So he was arrested for the items that he had in his house, and he was taken into custody.
Under police interrogation, Larry Taylor maintains his innocence.
I didn't do anything wrong. Everything I did to her is what she wanted me to do.
He said that she liked it, and everything else that had occurred, those assaults were either accidental in nature or, quote, she wanted it that way, end quote. We did eventually find evidence of Carrie's attack in the trailer. I believe her bra was found, ID card was found, and he had taken Polaroid photos of her.
And during the course of their investigation, police also learned that Larry Taylor had been stalking Carrie for weeks.
That was really scary, hearing that. So I guess he has had it planned for a while.
Let's go inside. It's almost dinner time, okay?
Mr. Taylor is a sexual deviant. Mr. Taylor liked what he did to Carrie. And I believe if Mr. Taylor's ever released from custody, he'll do it again. Only the next time, he'll make sure that his victim is dead.
And even though she survives her ordeal, Carrie and her loved ones are left with scars.
Jen had guilt because she was with her that night and something stupid that let Carrie leave. That's hard to get over stuff like that, really.
The only time I left the house after that was only to go to the prosecutor's office. I had to go to the doctor's every Friday because of the wounds, but I didn't go anywhere else. Jen stayed on the couch just about every night with me. I never stayed by myself.
On April 7th, 1995, Larry Taylor is indicted on 8 charges, including attempted murder, rape, kidnapping, and assault. A jury finds him guilty on all counts except attempted murder and sentences him to up to 165 years in prison. But he remains eligible for parole.
I vowed that I wouldn't miss a parole hearing. I would make sure that he stayed in there the rest of his life.
When she first had to go to the parole hearing, I was very nervous for her. I was very scared because I didn't want her having to talk about it. That's where I feel like I become the protective sister. But she told me, she says, I got this, Angie. This is what I'm fighting for, to keep him where he needs to be.
Going to the parole hearing gives me my power back, and it shows I'm a survivor. I'm not a victim.
She wants to tell people her story if it will help them if they've been victimized like this, and her strength can be their strength.
Even though something bad happens, you can get over it. It doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it takes years and years, but you can do it. I got my life still. I fought for it, so I'm just happy for that.
"34 years. That is how long the answer remained buried. 34 years since 4 teenage girls walked into a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas on a December night and never walked back out. 34 years since a fire turned a small neighborhood business into one of the most infamous crime scenes in Texas. 34 years of photographs, interviews, interrogations, courtrooms, overturned convictions, broken families, unanswered questions, and evidence locked away in boxes while the city moved on around it. But the evidence did not forget. and neither did the DNA. Just before midnight on December 6, 1991, an Austin police officer noticed flames coming from the building at 2949 West Anderson Lane. The business was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. It should have been an ordinary place. Bright lights, refrigerated desserts, teenage employees, families stopping for something sweet after dinner. Instead, firefighters entered the burning building and found 4 bodies. Jennifer Harbison was 17. Her younger sister, Sarah Harbison, was 15. Eliza Thomas was 17. Amy Ayers was only 13. For girls. For lives. One crime scene. And somewhere inside that burning building was a secret that would survive for more than 3 decades. The fire had been set deliberately. Investigators quickly realized this was not an accident. The girls had been attacked before the flames consumed the shop. The scene was chaotic. Heat had damaged evidence. Water from firefighters had moved or destroyed traces that detectives desperately needed. Every minute mattered. Every object mattered. But the killer had already disappeared. There was no suspect waiting outside. No confession. No eyewitness who could point directly to the murderer. Only a burned building, 4 dead teenagers, and a city demanding an explanation. The case exploded across Austin. Parents watched their daughters differently. Teenagers looked over their shoulders. Businesses closed their doors earlier. Every stranger seemed capable of becoming a suspect. And investigators began reconstructing the final hours of 4 girls whose lives had been ordinary only hours earlier. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters. Eliza and Amy were their friends and co-workers. They were teenagers in a city that, like countless American cities, believed terrible things happened somewhere else. Not here. Not to girls working in a yogurt shop. Not on an ordinary Friday night. But evil does not need a dramatic setting. Sometimes it waits behind a counter. Sometimes it enters through a door that was open for customers. Sometimes the last person a victim sees looks completely ordinary. The first investigators faced a problem that would haunt the case for years. The crime scene itself was fighting against them. Fire had destroyed evidence. Water had contaminated what remained. And every theory created another question. Why these girls? Why the yogurt shop? Was robbery the motive? Was the killer known to them? Was this a random attack? Or had someone deliberately chosen a location because it offered privacy, darkness, and time? The questions multiplied faster than detectives could answer them. Then came the suspects. And with them came the first great tragedy of the investigation. Instead of finding the person responsible, investigators eventually focused on young men who would spend years trapped inside the shadow of the murders. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn. Their names would become permanently attached to the case. But decades later, those names would be followed by another word. Innocent. The investigation would eventually reveal just how dangerous a desperate search for certainty could become. Years after the murders, 2 of the men were convicted. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death. Michael Scott received a life sentence. For families desperate for justice, the convictions appeared to provide an ending. But the evidence never truly settled the question. And when modern DNA testing was applied to evidence from the crime scene, it did something that courtroom testimony had failed to do. It contradicted the story. The biological evidence did not point toward the men who had been convicted. The case began to fracture. Trials were overturned. Convictions collapsed. The accused men were released. But release was not the same thing as restoration. A man can walk out of prison and still carry the prison with him. A family can hear the words, "charges dismissed," and still remember every headline. A city can say wrongful conviction and still wonder who actually killed the girls. The murders remained. For teenagers remained dead, and the killer remained unnamed. For years, detectives returned to the same evidence, the same photographs, the same reports, the same boxes, the same fragments. Technology changed. Forensic science changed. DNA analysis became faster and more sensitive. Investigators learned to extract information from evidence that earlier generations could barely analyze. And somewhere in that transformation, the old case began to breathe again. In 2022, Austin Police Detective Daniel Jackson was assigned to the cold case. He did not have the luxury of starting fresh. He inherited decades of investigative history. Some evidence had been tested before. Some had been tested with older methods. Some items had never received the kind of analysis that modern technology could now provide. So investigators began asking a simple question. What had been overlooked? The answer would eventually lead them to a piece of evidence that had been sitting inside the case for decades. A small .380 cartridge. It had been recovered from a drain at the yogurt shop. For years, that casing had existed in the evidence record without producing the breakthrough investigators needed. Then, in June 2025, Detective Jackson realized something important. The casing had not been submitted to the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, known as NIBIN, in many years. The technology had improved. The databases had grown. The software had become more powerful. And the evidence was still there. So they ran it again. The result was not a name. Not yet. It was a hit connected to an unsolved 1998 murder in Kentucky. A different state. A different victim. A different year. But similarities began to emerge. Investigators started comparing the cases. The possibility was suddenly too important to ignore. What if the yogurt shop murders had never been an isolated event? What if the person who entered that Austin store had done this before? Or afterward? What if the killer had spent years moving through the country, leaving behind victims and evidence that investigators had never connected? Then came another breakthrough. YST testing. A specialized form of DNA analysis focused on genetic material passed along the male line. Investigators asked laboratories across the United States to conduct a manual search for the unknown profile. Several laboratories produced partial hits. But only one laboratory, the South Carolina State Laboratory, identified a complete 27-allele YSDR match to the unknown profile. The name attached to that profile was Robert Eugene Brashers, a man who had been dead for more than 25 years. And suddenly, the story changed. Brashers had a violent history. He had been linked to a 1990 sexual assault and murder in Greenville, South Carolina. He had died by suicide in Missouri in 1999. There would be no interrogation. No Courtroom Stories. No dramatic moment when detectives placed evidence on a table and watched the suspect break down. The man investigators now believed was responsible was already gone. But investigators were not finished. Because DNA can point toward a person, ballistics can point toward a weapon, and timelines can connect one event to another. On December 8, 1991, less than 48 hours after the Austin murders, Brashers was stopped by Border Patrol at a checkpoint between El Paso, Texas, and Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was driving a stolen vehicle from Georgia, and he had a .380 pistol. That detail might have disappeared into history. Except the weapon did not disappear. According to Austin police, the gun later recovered from Brashers was the same firearm he used to kill himself in 1999. The serial numbers matched. The weapon was the same make and model associated with the shooting of Amy Ayers. And now investigators had something they had never possessed in 1991. A bridge between biological evidence, ballistic evidence, and a suspect who had unknowingly left a trail across decades. But even then, there was another question. Was this really the end? Or was it simply the closest investigators had ever come? Because identifying a dead suspect is not the same as bringing a murderer into a courtroom. There would be no trial, no jury, no cross-examination, no chance for the accused to answer. And that distinction matters, especially in a case that had already demonstrated how badly an investigation could go when certainty arrived before proof. For more than 3 decades, four men had lived beneath accusations that changed the course of their lives. 2 had been convicted. 2 had faced charges or suspicion. And one of them, Maurice Pierce, would not live to see the final chapter. The case had already produced one devastating lesson. A confession is not necessarily the truth. A conviction is not necessarily justice. And a suspect is not necessarily the killer. Now, in 2025 and 2026, the evidence was telling a different story. On February 19th, 2026, a Texas judge formally declared Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce innocent of the murders. 3 decades after the arrests. Decades after the headlines. Decades after the courtroom battles. Decades after the lives of 4 young men had become inseparable from 4 murdered girls. The legal record finally began to separate them. But the 4 girls could never be separated from the crime. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy. Their names were there before the suspect, before the convictions, before the DNA, before the cold case unit, and they would remain there after all of it. Because beneath every forensic breakthrough is the same brutal fact. For teenagers went to work. For teenagers expected to go home. They never did. And somewhere between the moment the yogurt shop doors closed and the flames appeared, a killer made a decision that would echo across Austin for 34 years. For decades, investigators believed the answer might be buried somewhere inside the ruins of that night. They were right. It had simply taken modern science to hear it. The evidence had been silent for years. Then one cartridge spoke. One DNA profile spoke. One ballistic connection spoke. And together, they pointed toward a man who could never be arrested. Robert Eugene Brashers, a name that had existed in criminal records long before it appeared in the Austin case. A man who had crossed state lines. A man who had been stopped in Texas less than 2 days after 4 girls were murdered. A man carrying a .380 pistol. A man who would die 8 years later without ever answering questions about Austin. For the families, that revelation carried a strange kind of weight. It was not the ending anyone had imagined. There was no handcuffed suspect. No courtroom. No sentence. No final confession. Only evidence. Evidence that had waited. Evidence that survived the fire. Evidence that survived failed investigations. Evidence that survived wrongful convictions. Evidence that survived the death of the man investigators now identify as the suspect. 34 years later, the question was no longer simply, who killed the girls? A new question had emerged. How much had the killer left behind without anyone realizing what it meant? Because the most frightening thing about a cold case is not always that the truth is impossible to find. Sometimes the truth is sitting in an evidence locker, waiting for technology to become good enough, waiting for someone to ask the right question, waiting for a detective to look at an old piece of evidence and realize that the past has not disappeared. It has only been waiting. And in Austin, after 34 years of silence, the past finally answered. But the answer did not arrive with a knock at the door. It arrived through a laboratory, through a database, through a genetic profile, through a bullet casing in a drain, and through the name of a dead man. A man who would never stand trial. A man who would never hear the victim's family speak. A man who would never explain what happened inside that yogurt shop on December 6th, 1991. The city had waited decades for a name. Now it had one. But for the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, a name could never bring back the years stolen from them. It could not erase the empty chairs. It could not undo Christmases without daughters, birthdays without sisters, photographs that stopped at 17, or 13, or 15. It could not give the girls another morning. And perhaps that is why this case remains so haunting. Because after 34 years, the mystery changed shape. The question was no longer whether the killer had disappeared without leaving a trace. He had left traces. The question was whether anyone could recognize them. For decades, the answer was no. Then science caught up with the evidence. And when it did, the evidence pointed backward. To a night in Austin. To a burning yogurt shop. To 4 girls whose names became permanently attached to a case that refused to die. And to a man who had been dead for more than 2 decades when investigators finally said his name. The fire was gone. The building was gone. The suspects had changed. The investigators had changed. The technology had changed. But the evidence remained. 34 years later, it was still there. Waiting in the darkness. Waiting for someone to listen. The evidence had been waiting in the darkness. But evidence alone does not solve a murder. Someone has to believe it. Someone has to reopen the file. Someone has to look at a piece of metal that had been sitting in storage for decades and ask a question that perhaps should have been asked much earlier. What if this casing had seen something the investigators never saw? In 2025, Austin Police Detective Daniel Jackson was working inside the cold case homicide unit when the old yogurt shop file came back into focus. The case was not new to the department. It had never really left. For 34 years, detectives had returned to it, tested evidence, interviewed people, reviewed old reports, and tried to make sense of a crime that had become almost legendary in Austin. But cold cases have a strange quality. They can become familiar. A detective can read the same report so many times that the words begin to lose their meaning. Names become entries. Dates become numbers. Evidence becomes inventory. Jackson had to make the old evidence feel new again. He started looking for gaps. Not just mistakes. Gaps. Things that had never been tested. Things tested with technology that no longer represented the limits of forensic science. Things that had been examined once and then forgotten. One of those items was a cartridge casing recovered from a drain at the yogurt shop. A tiny piece of metal. Almost insignificant. But inside a murder investigation, nothing is insignificant. The casing was associated with a .380 caliber weapon. Investigators had known about it for years. What changed was the technology available to compare it. The National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN, allows law enforcement agencies to compare images of fired cartridge cases and identify possible links between shootings. The system had existed for years, but the evidence from the yogurt shop had not been submitted in the way Jackson now believed it should be. So the old casing was scanned. The machine did not know the girls. It did not know Austin. It did not know the headlines. It knew only patterns. Tiny marks left behind when a firearm fires. Marks created by machinery. Marks that can be as individual as a fingerprint. And then the system produced something investigators have been waiting 34 years to see. A connection. The casing was linked to a 1998 murder in Greenville, South Carolina. Suddenly, Austin was no longer the only place investigators had to examine. There was another victim. Another state. Another crime. And potentially one man moving through both stories. Investigators began digging into the Greenville case. The name they found was Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers was not an unknown figure. His criminal history was already dark. He had been connected to violent offenses. He had been identified as a serial killer and rapist. And he had died in 1999. That fact created an immediate problem. Even if the evidence connected him to Austin, he could never be arrested. He could never sit across from detectives. He could never be confronted with photographs of the 4 girls. He could never explain why he had been in Texas. He could never tell investigators what happened inside the yogurt shop. He was gone. But his DNA was not. And that changed everything. On August 22, 2025, Austin investigators received a report from the South Carolina laboratory. The unknown YSDR profile from the yogurt shop had been linked to a known profile from the 1990 Greenville sexual assault and murder. The profile belonged to Brasher's. YSDR testing was crucial because it examines genetic markers on the Y chromosome, allowing investigators to identify a male genetic line even when conventional DNA analysis may be limited. The science was not the kind of magic people imagine when they hear the words DNA evidence. It was more complicated, more technical, and in some ways, more fragile. A DNA result is not a story. It is evidence. It must be interpreted. It must be compared. It must be tested against other evidence. And investigators now had something else. A timeline. December 6, 1991. The 4 girls were murdered in Austin. Less than 48 hours later, Brasher's was stopped by Border Patrol at a westbound checkpoint between El Paso and Las Cruces. He was driving a stolen vehicle from Georgia, and he had a .380 pistol. That detail landed differently now. 34 years earlier, it would have been one more piece of information buried inside an old report. In 2025, it was suddenly part of a chain. A .380 casing at the yogurt shop. A .380 pistol in Brasher's possession. A Border Patrol stop in Texas. A stolen vehicle. A man connected through YSDR DNA to another murder. And then another extraordinary fact. The firearm recovered from Brasher's was confirmed to be the same gun he later used when he died by suicide in Missouri in 1999. The serial numbers matched. The gun was no longer an abstract possibility. It was a physical object with a documented history. A weapon. A man. A timeline. A biological connection. The pieces were beginning to align. But investigators still had to be careful. Because this case had already taught Austin what happens when investigators convince themselves that they have the answer. Years earlier, 4 other young men had been placed under suspicion. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn. Their involvement had become one of the darkest chapters of the investigation. Springsteen and Scott were eventually convicted. Springsteen received a death sentence. Scott received life in prison. For families desperate for justice, the convictions seemed to close the case. But physical evidence did not support the convictions in the way prosecutors had hoped. DNA testing eventually failed to connect Springsteen and Scott to the biological evidence from the crime scene. Their convictions unraveled, and the case remained open. That history mattered enormously when Brasher's name emerged. Police could not simply announce a suspect and declare the mystery solved. They had to distinguish between suspicion and proof, between a lead and a conclusion, between what the evidence established and what investigators merely believed. Austin police publicly identified Brasher's as a suspect in September 2025. The department described the breakthrough as the most significant development in the case in decades. But investigators also emphasized that the case remained open and ongoing. That distinction is important, because Robert Eugene Brasher's could not defend himself. He could not be cross-examined. He could not provide an alibi. He could not explain the evidence. And he could not tell the families what happened. The only voice left was the evidence. and the evidence had to speak for itself. For the families, the announcement was almost impossible to process. 34 years is longer than an entire generation. Parents had grown old. Friends had grown old. People who remembered the girls as teenagers were now grandparents. Some witnesses had died. Some investigators had retired. Some had passed away. Some memories had faded. Others had become sharper with time. But the 4 girls remained frozen in the photographs. Jennifer Harbison, 17. Sarah Harbison, 15. Eliza Thomas, 17. Amy Ayers, 13. 4 young lives interrupted in one violent night. Their families had lived with an unbearable question. Who did this? For decades, there was no answer. Then came a name belonging to a man who had been dead since 1999. The discovery did not erase the past. It exposed it. It forced investigators to look backward again. And that backward journey revealed something almost as disturbing as the identity of the new suspect. The killer had not simply vanished. He had left a trail. The trail had crossed state lines. It touched other violent crimes. It included a stolen vehicle, a firearm, a border patrol stop, a known criminal history, and biological evidence that remained hidden inside the old case. The killer had been somewhere. He had been moving. And less than 2 days after the Austin murders, he was apparently carrying the kind of weapon investigators believed had been used inside the yogurt shop. Yet nobody knew. Nobody connected the dots. The case went cold. The city moved forward, and the 4 wrongly accused men lived under the weight of an investigation that had pointed in the wrong direction. That part of the story cannot be separated from the DNA breakthrough. Because solving a cold case is not only about identifying the person who committed the crime. Sometimes it is also about identifying the people who did not. For Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, that distinction came after years of legal battles. For Forrest Wellborn, suspicion followed him even without a conviction. For Maurice Pierce, the story ended before the final judicial declaration could reach him. Pierce died in 2010. He would never hear the words spoken in a Texas courtroom 16 years later. He would never stand beside the other men as the court finally addressed the record. But on February 19, 2026, a Travis County judge formally declared all 4 men innocent of the yogurt shop murders. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, Maurice Pierce. For names once connected to the crime. For names now separated from it. The courtroom moment carried a weight that no forensic report could capture. Because an exoneration is not merely a legal technicality. It is an attempt to correct history. For decades, these men have been forced to live with the accusation that they had murdered 4 teenage girls. Now the court had formally rejected that conclusion. And the case had a different name attached to it. Robert Eugene Brashers. But even that did not mean every question had been answered. Why Austin? Why that yogurt shop? Why those 4 girls? Was the crime planned? Was it spontaneous? Had Brashers been watching the location? Did he know the victims? Was he passing through? Did he choose the shop because it was isolated? Or did the attack begin as something else and spiral into murder? These questions remain. And they matter because identifying a suspect does not automatically reconstruct an entire night. Investigators can follow DNA. They can follow ballistic evidence. They can follow travel records. They can reconstruct timelines. But there is one thing forensic science cannot recover. A victim's final thoughts. We can know where someone was. We can know what evidence they left behind. We can know how a weapon moved from one place to another. We can know when a fire started. We can know when the police arrived. But we cannot know exactly what Amy Ayers was thinking in her final moments. We cannot know what Jennifer Harbison said to her sister. We cannot know what Sarah saw. We cannot know what Eliza heard. Those details disappeared with them. And perhaps that is why the case still feels unfinished even after the breakthrough. Because a name is not the same thing as an explanation. A DNA profile is not a confession. A ballistic match is not a conversation. And a dead suspect cannot answer the questions that have haunted 4 families for 34 years. Yet something important had changed. The case was no longer floating without direction. For the first time, the evidence had converged. DNA. Ballistics. A weapon. A timeline. A known violent offender. A man who had been in Texas almost immediately after the murders. And a firearm whose history extended from the yogurt shop investigation to the suspect's own death. The darkness had not disappeared, but investigators had finally found shape inside it. And that shape had a name. Robert Eugene Brashers. The man who had been dead for 26 years when Austin detectives finally identified him. The irony was brutal. The killer could not be arrested because he had already escaped the reach of the law. But the evidence had outlived him. That may be the most haunting detail of all. He had died, believing the past was behind him. The investigation had gone cold. The accused men had been released. Austin had changed. Technology had changed. But the evidence had remained. And decades later, it began assembling the story without him. A casing. A genetic profile. A firearm. A checkpoint. A dead man. For innocent men. For murdered girls. One case. 34 years. And a truth that had been waiting for the world to become capable of finding it. But there was still one final problem. The city now knew the name of the man investigators believed committed the murders. The court had cleared the men who had been accused. The forensic trail had become stronger. Yet the night itself remained largely silent. And somewhere inside that silence were the details that could explain how a seemingly ordinary Friday night became one of the most infamous crime scenes in Austin history. The evidence had finally pointed toward Robert Eugene Brashers. But to understand how that evidence could have survived for 34 years, it was necessary to return to the beginning. Not to the courtroom. Not to the laboratory. Not to the databases. Back to the yogurt shop. Back to December 6th, 1991. Back to the final ordinary minutes before the lights went out. Because before the case became a cold case, before it became a headline, before it became a forensic puzzle, it was simply a place where 4 girls were working. And somewhere outside that building, someone was moving through the darkness. Somewhere outside that building, someone was moving through the darkness. And inside the shop, the night was still pretending to be normal. It was Friday, December 6th, 1991. Austin was not yet the city it would become. The skyline was smaller. The roads were quieter. Computers were primitive compared with the machines investigators would use decades later. There were no smartphones, no digital surveillance networks, no modern forensic databases capable of comparing evidence across thousands of cases in seconds. A teenager could disappear behind a closed storefront and leave almost no digital footprint at all. That night, the yogurt shop was closing. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas were employees. Sarah Harbison and Amy Ayers were there with them. For girls. For lives. For teenagers inside a business that should have been empty before long. Then something happened. Someone entered. The exact sequence remains one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Investigators would eventually determine that the girls had been bound and gagged. They had been shot. Then came the fire. And the fire changed everything. Shortly before midnight, an Austin Patrol officer noticed flames coming from the building at 2949 West Anderson Lane. The call went out. Firefighters arrived. They entered the building expecting a fire. Instead, they discovered something far worse. 4 bodies. The victims were found inside the burned yogurt shop. The girls were dead. The building was filling with smoke and heat. Automatic sprinklers had activated. Water poured through the scene. Fire consumed parts of the evidence. The clock was already working against investigators. Every second of the fire destroyed something. Every second of the water damaged something else. And when the flames finally disappeared, detectives were left with a crime scene that had been altered by the very emergency response intended to save lives. This was the beginning of the nightmare. There was no obvious killer. No weapon lying neatly beside a body. No surveillance footage showing a face. No digital record tracing a suspect's phone. No modern database waiting to connect the evidence to another state. There were only fragments. Fragments of a violent night. And investigators had to reconstruct the entire event from them. The victims had been teenagers. That fact changed the atmosphere immediately. Austin was shocked. Parents wanted answers. The community wanted someone arrested. And detectives understood that every hour without an answer could make the case harder. The first challenge was determining what had happened before the fire. The girls had not simply died in an accidental blaze. They had been murdered. The fire had been deliberate. The killer had wanted the crime scene destroyed. That meant investigators were not simply searching for a murderer. They were searching through the remains of an attempted erasure. The killer had tried to burn the evidence. But fire is unpredictable. It destroys some things. It preserves others. And sometimes the smallest objects survive. A cartridge casing. A trace of biological material. A microscopic mark. A fragment that seems meaningless in 1991 can become decisive decades later. But nobody knew that yet. In those first hours, investigators needed a suspect. They needed a motive. They needed witnesses. They needed anything. And the phones began ringing. Tips came in. Names appeared. Rumors spread. Austin became a city filled with theories. Some were credible. Many were not. The police received thousands of tips and dozens of supposed confessions. Most led nowhere. Then, within a week, investigators encountered a young man whose name would become permanently attached to the investigation. His name was Maurice Pierce. He was 16 years old. Pierce had been arrested for bringing a gun to North Cross Mall. The gun happened to be the same make and model as one of the weapons believed to have been used in the yogurt shop murders. That coincidence was enough to make investigators look closer. Then came the interrogation. Hours passed. Detectives questioned Pierce. Eventually, he confessed to the murders. For investigators desperate for a breakthrough, the confession appeared enormous. A teenager had admitted to the crime. There was a weapon. There was a story. There was a suspect. But the next morning, Detective John Jones interviewed Pierce again. And something did not fit. The confession did not match the physical evidence from the crime scene. The details were wrong. The story was wrong. The pieces did not align. Ballistics testing was conducted on the .22 caliber gun seized from Pierce. The result was inconclusive. Not a clean match. Not a definitive connection. The first apparent breakthrough was already collapsing. But the pressure for answers did not disappear. The murders remained unsolved. 4 girls were still dead. The city was still frightened. And investigators were still looking for someone to blame. That is where cold cases can become dangerous. Because the longer a crime remains unsolved, the more powerful the desire for closure becomes. A detective wants an answer. A prosecutor wants a case. A family wants justice. A community wants the nightmare to end. But justice cannot simply mean finding someone. It has to mean finding the right person. The difference between those two things would eventually define the Austin yogurt shop case. For years, the investigation continued. Then came a new era. 1999. 8 years had passed. The original investigation was reopened and reviewed by a new task force. Detectives went back through the old files. Names resurfaced. Interviews were reconsidered. For men became central to the renewed investigation. Maurice Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn. The investigators questioned them. The interrogations became intense. Springsteen and Scott eventually confessed. They implicated each other. Their statements became the foundation of the prosecution. Wellborn did not confess. Pierce did not confess to the murders during the renewed investigation. But all 4 men were arrested and charged with capital murder in 1999. The city had waited 8 years. Now there were arrests. The headlines returned. The case appeared to be moving toward an ending. But an ending is not always the truth. Michael Scott went to trial. Robert Springsteen went to trial. Both were convicted. Scott received life without parole. Springsteen received the death penalty. The 4 murder girls finally had what appeared to be justice. But something was missing. Physical evidence. No physical evidence from the yogurt shop had ever been linked to the 4 men. The case depended heavily on confessions and statements. And as the years passed, questions about those confessions became harder to ignore. Then the law changed. In 2004, the United States Supreme Court issued its decision in Crawford v. Washington. The ruling changed the landscape surrounding certain testimonial evidence and confrontation rights. For Scott and Springsteen, the legal consequences were enormous. Their cases were sent back. New trials became possible. And during preparation for those proceedings, investigators returned to the physical evidence. That decision would ultimately transform the entire case. Because the old evidence was about to tell a different story. Swabs from the sexual assault kit were examined. A laboratory developed a 16-marker unknown YSDR profile. The profile came from an unknown male. Investigators compared it with the men who had been accused. The result was devastating for the prosecution. All 4 original suspects were excluded as contributors to the unknown YSDR profile. Every one of them. The biological evidence did not point toward Pierce. It did not point toward Springsteen. It did not point toward Scott. It did not point toward Wellborn. The 4 men who had spent years attached to the case were not the source of the unknown male DNA. Suddenly, the investigation had a problem. If the biological evidence belonged to another man, then who was he? The question changed everything. Charges were dropped pending further investigation. But the unknown profile remained. A genetic fingerprint without a name. A silent witness. And for years, investigators collected reference samples. Hundreds of them. They compared people. They eliminated suspects. They searched. Nothing. The profile remained unidentified. The case entered another long period of silence. But this time the silence was different. The investigators had something. They just did not know whose something it was. The DNA was waiting. The cartridge casing was waiting. The ballistic evidence was waiting. And the old case file continued to grow heavier with every passing year. Then another tragedy struck. Maurice Pierce would not live to see the investigation reach its eventual breakthrough. On December 23, 2010, Pierce was stopped during a traffic incident. He fled on foot. Austin police officer Frank Wilson pursued him. The two struggled. During the confrontation, Pierce took Officer Wilson's knife from his belt and stabbed him in the neck. Wilson survived. Pierce was shot and killed by Officer Wilson. And another name disappeared from the case before the full truth had been established. Years later, the court would formally clear Pierce along with the other men. But in 2010, the yogurt shop murders were still unsolved. The unknown DNA profile still had no name. The girls were still dead. And the man responsible was still somewhere in the past. That is the cruel mathematics of a cold case. Every year adds distance. Every year removes witnesses. Every year memories fade. People move. Records disappear. Buildings are demolished. Technology becomes obsolete. And suspects die. The investigation can become a race between science and time. But in this case, time did something unexpected. It preserved evidence. The DNA did not forget. The firearm did not forget. The cartridge casing did not forget. And somewhere in another state, another murder had left behind another trail. A trail that would eventually intersect with Austin. But nobody in Austin knew it yet. The connection would take more than a decade to emerge. The breakthrough would not come from a dramatic confession. It would not come from a witness suddenly remembering a face. It would not come from a detective discovering a hidden diary. It would come from a machine examining patterns invisible to the human eye. And it would begin with something investigators had held for decades. A fired cartridge casing, small enough to disappear inside a hand. Small enough to be overlooked. Small enough to survive a fire. But marked forever by the weapon that fired it. Every firearm leaves microscopic impressions on a cartridge case. The firing pin strikes. The breech face presses. The extractor grips. The ejector pushes. Metal meets metal. And in that violent fraction of a second, the gun leaves behind a signature. In 1991, investigators could examine those marks. But the world of ballistic databases was nowhere near what it would become. Decades later, Kneebean offered something the original investigators did not have. A national network of comparisons. A way to ask whether one fired cartridge case had a relative somewhere else in the country. In 2025, Detective Daniel Jackson looked again. The old casing had never been submitted to Kneebean in recent years. That was the gap. That was the question. What happens if the evidence is tested again? The answer came back from a completely different murder. Greenville, South Carolina. 1998. A separate crime. A separate victim. A separate investigation. But the cartridge casing created a connection. And now the investigators had a direction. They began looking for the man associated with the other case. Robert Eugene Brashers. A name that would soon become the most important name in the Austin yogurt shop investigation. But before investigators could place Brashers at the center of the case, they needed more than a ballistic lead. They needed DNA. And the DNA was already waiting. The unknown YSDR profile had been sitting in the case for years. A genetic shadow. Investigators needed to know whether that shadow belonged to Brashers. The South Carolina State Laboratory conducted the critical comparison. And then, on August 22, 2025, the report arrived. The unknown YSDR profile from the Austin yogurt shop murders was linked to a known YSDR profile from a 1990 sexual assault and murder in Greenville, South Carolina. The profile belonged to Robert Eugene Brashers. The man had been dead since 1999, but the DNA had survived. And now the investigators had something that the original detectives never could have imagined. A biological connection reaching from Austin to South Carolina. A cold case speaking through another cold case. And a suspect who could no longer be questioned. The discovery was enormous. But the most disturbing piece was still waiting. Because investigators now looked at the timeline. December 6, 1991. 4 girls murdered. Yogurt shop burned. December 8, 1991. Less than 48 hours later. Brasher stopped by Border Patrol between El Paso and Las Cruces. He was driving a stolen car from Georgia. He had a .380 pistol. And according to Austin police, the gun was the same make and model identified through ballistics as the weapon used to shoot Amy Ayers. The serial number connected the weapon to the firearm Brasher's later used to kill himself in 1999. The case had suddenly become a chain. Austin. The cartridge casing. Greenville. The DNA. The weapon. The Border Patrol checkpoint. Brasher's. The chain did not answer every question, but it was stronger than anything investigators had possessed before. For 34 years, the case had been defined by uncertainty. Now, uncertainty had a direction. The killer had a name. The name belonged to a man who was already dead. And the most haunting question was no longer whether investigators would ever identify him. It was how close they had been to him all along. Because on December 8th, 1991, only 2 days after the girls were murdered, Robert Eugene Brasher's was apparently driving west through the desert. A stolen car. A .380 pistol. A man moving away from Texas. And behind him, a city beginning the investigation that would consume decades. He passed through a checkpoint. He was caught with the weapon. He was charged with auto theft and being a felon in possession of a firearm. And then the moment passed. The investigators in Austin did not yet know his name. The Border Patrol agents did not know what the gun might mean. The weapon would eventually return to Brasher's family. Years later, Brasher's would use it when he died, and the gun would remain connected to the same man. A physical object traveling silently through history. From a Texas desert checkpoint, to another state, to a suicide in Missouri, and finally, through forensic investigation, back to Austin. The weapon had crossed years. The DNA had crossed states. The evidence had crossed generations. But the girls had never moved. Their lives had stopped on one December night. The investigation had not. It simply took 34 years to catch up. And when it finally did, it found a man who could no longer speak. A man whose death had occurred decades before his name appeared in the Austin case. A man who would never answer the questions that remained. Why did he go to that yogurt shop? How long had he been watching it? Did he know the girls? Did he intend to kill them? Why did he set the fire? Why did he leave Austin so quickly? And what else did he do that investigators still have not connected to him? Those questions remain suspended in the darkness. But one thing is different now. The 4 men who once carried the burden of the accusation have been formally cleared. And the evidence has given investigators another name. A dead man. A gun. A DNA profile. A cartridge casing. A timeline. 34 years after the flames rose above the yogurt shop, the pieces are finally beginning to occupy the same picture. But the picture is still incomplete. Because somewhere between the moment those girls closed the doors and the moment the patrol officers saw the flames, a sequence of events unfolded that only one person truly understood. And that person is no longer alive. So the investigators are left with what he left behind. Metal. Blood. DNA. Ballistics. Records. And the silence of a dead man. For 34 years, that silence protected him. Now, for the first time, the evidence is speaking louder than the silence ever did. For the first time, the evidence is speaking louder than the silence ever did. But evidence has its own language. It does not shout. It does not accuse. It does not explain. It leaves patterns. And detectives have to learn how to read them. For decades, the Austin yogurt shop murders have been a case built around absence. Nori la lleve la eyewitness. No surviving suspect. No confession that could withstand scrutiny. No physical evidence that could place the original defendants inside the crime scene. No final answer. Only questions. The fire had erased much of the scene. The investigation had consumed years. The wrong men had been prosecuted. And the unknown male DNA profile had remained just that, unknown. Then the technology changed. That may be the most important part of the story. Not because technology suddenly created evidence. The evidence had always existed. Technology simply made it possible to understand what had been sitting there all along. A cartridge casing does not become evidence when a computer recognizes it. It was evidence the moment it landed in the drain. A biological sample does not become meaningful when a laboratory produces a genetic profile. It was already carrying information. The information was simply trapped inside material investigators in 1991 could not fully decode. That distinction matters, because the killer did not leave Austin without leaving anything behind. He left traces. The problem was that nobody knew what they meant. For years, the unknown YSDR profile was one of those traces. It belonged to an unidentified male. That was all investigators could say. There was no name, no address, no photograph, no criminal record, just a genetic signature, a shadow without a face. Investigators searched databases. They compared samples. They followed leads. Nothing. The profile refused to identify itself. Then came the ballistic connection. The old cartridge casing was entered into Nebeen. The system found a potential connection to the 1998 Greenville murder. That connection pulled investigators towards South Carolina. And South Carolina pulled them toward Robert Eugene Brasher's. Now the unknown DNA had a possible identity. But investigators still needed to establish whether the man behind that identity could actually fit the Austin timeline. This is where old records became as important as modern laboratories. Because a cold case is rarely solved by one piece of evidence. It is solved when independent pieces begin pointing in the same direction. The DNA pointed toward Brasher's. The ballistic evidence pointed toward a firearm associated with Brasher's. The timeline placed him in Texas almost immediately after the Austin murders. His criminal history provided another layer of context. None of those facts, taken alone, could reconstruct the entire crime. Together, they created something much more powerful. A pattern. And patterns are what cold case detectives live for. But patterns can also deceive. That was a lesson Austin had already learned the hard way. The city had once watched 4 men become the center of the investigation. Those men had been accused. 2 had been convicted. 1 had been sentenced to death. Yet the physical evidence eventually excluded them. That history meant investigators now had to be exceptionally careful. They could not repeat the past. They could not allow the need for closure to become stronger than the evidence. They had to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it led to a man who was dead, even if it meant admitting that the case could never have the ending families traditionally imagine. There would be no arrest, no interrogation room, no confession, no trial, no verdict. Only a conclusion built from evidence. And perhaps that made the breakthrough even more unsettling, because Robert Eugene Brasher's could not contradict it. But he could not confirm it either. The dead do not answer questions. They leave behind artifacts. The gun. The DNA. The records. The photographs. The reports. The fragments of a life that investigators attempt to reconstruct after the person is gone. Brasher's had lived a violent life before his death. His name appeared in other investigations. His movements crossed state lines. And the weapon connected to him had a documented history. But investigators still had to ask a fundamental question. Could this man have physically committed the Austin murders? The answer increasingly appeared to be yes. The timeline was one of the most striking pieces. On the night of December 6, 1991, the 4 girls were murdered in Austin. The yogurt shop was set on fire. 2 days later, Brasher's was stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint. He was not stopped in downtown Austin. He was not discovered near the yogurt shop. He was already moving west. The vehicle he was driving had been stolen in Georgia. The gun he carried was a .380, the same caliber associated with the shooting of Amy Ayers. It was an extraordinary coincidence. But detectives knew better than to call it proof simply because it sounded extraordinary. They needed the forensic connection, and the firearm supplied another piece. The gun later used by Brasher's to kill himself in Missouri in 1999 was traced by serial number. The weapon existed. Its history existed. And ballistic examination linked it to the cartridge casing recovered from the Austin crime scene. The gun had survived. So had the evidence. So had the question. Who fired it? For decades, investigators have been asking that question without knowing that the answer might already be hidden inside another man's criminal history. That is what makes the case so disturbing. The killer did not need to leave a handwritten confession. He left a weapon. He left biological evidence. He left a timeline. He left enough information to eventually identify him. But only after 34 years. Imagine the difference between December 1991 and 2025. In 1991, investigators had to physically move evidence. Photographs were printed. Reports were typed. Fingerprints were manually compared. DNA technology was still developing. A national ballistic network capable of quickly searching millions of records was not the investigative tool it would become. There was no modern genetic genealogy landscape. No smartphones tracking movement. No cloud storage preserving every conversation. No digital cameras recording every street. The killer entered a world where disappearing was easier. And he almost succeeded. Almost. Because the one thing he could not control was time. Time destroys memory. But time also creates technology. Time destroys buildings. But evidence can survive inside boxes. Time allows suspects to die. But DNA does not care whether the person who left it is alive. That is the strange mathematics of a cold case. The investigation becomes stronger in some ways as the years pass. The victim remains the same. The crime remains the same. But the tools become better. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the past suddenly becomes readable. For Jennifer's family, the discovery carried a painful complexity. For Sarah's family, it was the same. For Eliza's family. For Amy's family. A suspect's name can answer one question while creating another. If investigators believe Brasher's was responsible, what happened to the 4 girls? Why them? Why that night? Why that location? Was a yogurt shop chosen randomly? Was it targeted? Did Brasher's know someone connected to the business? Was he passing through Austin? Did he enter expecting to commit a robbery? Did the violence escalate? Or had the murders been planned from the beginning? These questions are not small details. They are the difference between identifying a killer and understanding a crime. But there is another reason the case remains so difficult. The people who knew the answers are gone. The victims are gone. Brasher's is gone. Some witnesses are gone. Some investigators are gone. Some memories exist only in old statements. And some details may never be recovered. That is the cruelest limitation of forensic science. DNA can identify a person. It cannot restore a conversation. Ballistics can connect a weapon. It cannot tell us what the shooter was thinking. A database can connect 2 crimes. It cannot explain why one person decided to commit them. The technology can narrow the darkness. It cannot illuminate every corner. And still, the breakthrough changed the history of the case. Because for years, the Austin murders have been remembered through the lens of the men who were accused. The wrong men. Their confessions. Their trials. Their convictions. Their appeals. Their years of fighting to prove what the evidence eventually established. They were not the killers. The unknown man remained. Now that unknown man had a name. Robert Eugene Brashers. That name altered the narrative. The case was no longer a story about 4 accused men and an unidentified killer. It became a story about 4 exonerated men for murdered girls and a dead suspect identified through evidence that survived him. But there was another shadow hanging over the breakthrough. The legal standard for saying someone committed a murder is different from the investigative standard for identifying a suspect. Austin police could identify Brashers as the suspect based on the evidence. But because he was dead, there would never be a criminal prosecution. That meant there could be no jury weighing every piece of evidence. No defense attorney challenging the DNA interpretation. No cross-examination of investigators. No witness taking the stand. No defendant sitting silently as the evidence accumulated. The public would have to understand the distinction. Investigators were not announcing a courtroom verdict. They were presenting the conclusion of a cold case investigation. And that conclusion rested on multiple independent lines of evidence. The distinction was particularly important because of the history of the case. Austin had already experienced what happens when a murder investigation reaches a premature conclusion. The first apparent solution had failed. The second had produced convictions that later collapsed. Now the investigators had to make sure the third answer was built on something stronger. They went back through everything. The firearm. The cartridge casing. The DNA. The South Carolina connection. The Border Patrol records. The timeline. The criminal history. The other murder. Each piece was examined against the others. And the picture became harder to dismiss. There was still uncertainty. There would always be uncertainty. But there was also convergence. The kind of convergence that makes investigators stop asking whether a coincidence is possible and start asking how many coincidences one case can contain before the pattern becomes unmistakable. The cartridge casing connected Austin to another murder. The DNA connected the Austin crime scene to Brashers. The firearm connected Brashers to the ballistic evidence. The timeline placed him in Texas immediately after the murders. And his later death explained why the case could never proceed in the traditional way. The killer was not hiding anymore. He had been dead for decades. The mystery had simply survived him. And the city had survived the mystery. Austin had grown. The yogurt shop disappeared into history. New businesses occupied old spaces. Children who were not born when the murders happened became adults. The teenagers who once knew the victims grew older. The investigators who had stood inside the burned building retired. But the case remained. Somewhere in the police department, the file continued to exist. Names. Photographs. Evidence numbers. Laboratory reports. Interview transcripts. Court records. A history of everything that went wrong. And everything that eventually went right. The most powerful evidence in the case was not necessarily the newest evidence. It was the old evidence interpreted through new eyes. That is why the story of the Austin yogurt shop murders is also a story about the evolution of forensic science. In 1991, the evidence had limits. In 1999, the investigation had different limits. In the early 2000s, DNA technology reopened possibilities. In the 2020s, ballistic databases and advanced YSDR analysis pushed those possibilities further. The science evolved. The evidence waited. And the truth moved closer. But one final question remained. What does justice look like when the person responsible is already dead? For some families, justice means a conviction. For others, it means a name. For others, it means clearing the innocent. And for some, perhaps justice simply means that the world finally acknowledges what happened. For girls were murdered. For young lives were taken. For other men were wrongly swept into the investigation. And the man now identified by investigators as the suspect died before the truth could catch up with him. There is no perfect ending to that story. There cannot be. The ending was stolen 34 years ago. Everything that came afterward has been an attempt to understand what happened. And the deeper investigators went, the more complicated the story became. The fire had not destroyed everything. The killer had not erased everything. And the wrongfully accused had not been forgotten. Evidence remained. Memory remained. And eventually, science connected them. But there was still one thing detectives could not reconstruct. The final hours. The final movements. The precise sequence inside that yogurt shop. The moment the girls realized they were in danger. The moment the killer decided to set the fire. The moment he walked away. Those moments remain locked inside the past. And perhaps they always will. Because the man investigators now believe was responsible is gone. His voice is gone. His explanation is gone. His secrets are gone with him. All that remains is what he left behind. A cartridge casing. A genetic profile. A firearm. A trail through several states. And 4 names that should never have become part of a murder investigation in the first place. Jennifer. Sarah. Eliza. Amy. For teenagers who should have grown older. For lives that should have continued. For families that should have been preparing for graduations, weddings, careers, children, ordinary arguments, ordinary birthdays, ordinary mornings. Instead, their futures became photographs. Their names became headlines. And their deaths became one of the most enduring cold cases in Texas. 34 years later, the case finally had a direction. Not a courtroom ending. Not a confession. Not a sentence. A direction. And sometimes, in a cold case, that is what the truth looks like. It arrives slowly, piece by piece, almost invisibly, until one day, the pieces are no longer scattered. They form a face. They form a name. They form a timeline. And suddenly the silence has nowhere left to hide. But the story was not over. Because identifying Robert Eugene Brashers was only the beginning of another question. How many other crimes might have been connected to the same man? How many victims had never received answers? How many families were still waiting? And how many pieces of evidence remained hidden in police evidence rooms across the country? The yogurt shop case had shown what could happen when one old cartridge casing was examined again. It raised the possibility that other cold cases might contain the same kind of forgotten bridge. A microscopic connection. A genetic clue. A weapon. A database hit. Something small enough to be ignored. Something powerful enough to change history. And somewhere, perhaps, another box was still waiting. Another piece of evidence. Another unanswered murder. Another family waiting for someone to look again. Because the most frightening lesson from Austin was not simply that a killer remained unidentified for 34 years. It was that the evidence had been there the entire time. Waiting. Silent. Patient. And impossible to destroy completely. The fire had tried. The years had tried. The failed investigation had tried. The wrong convictions had buried the truth beneath layers of legal history. But the evidence survived. And when investigators finally knew how to listen, it spoke. Not in a confession, not in a headline, but in numbers, patterns, genetic markers, ballistic impressions, and a name. Robert Eugene Brashers, a dead man finally pulled from the shadows by the traces he had left behind. Yet even now, the final image is not Brashers. It is not the gun. It is not the laboratory. It is not the courtroom. It is the yogurt shop. The place where 4 girls expected another ordinary night. The place that became a crime scene. The place that burned. The place where the first clues were left behind. And the place where, 34 years later, the truth finally began to emerge from the ashes. The truth finally began to emerge from the ashes. But ashes do not tell a story by themselves. They leave fragments. Fragments that have to be assembled. And in the Austin yogurt shop murders, every fragment seemed to lead somewhere darker. For years, the case had been treated as a single terrible event. For girls. One store. One fire. One unknown killer. But the deeper investigators went, the more the case began to resemble a web. A web stretching across state lines. A web connecting old crimes to new technology. A web in which one piece of evidence could suddenly make another piece meaningful. That is what happened when investigators began examining Robert Eugene Brashers more closely. His name was no longer just a possibility. His history became part of the investigation. The man had lived in several places. He had appeared in criminal records. He had crossed state lines. And his name had already surfaced in connection with violence before Austin investigators ever knew who he was. That history mattered. Not because a criminal record proves a new crime. It is not. A person cannot be convicted of murder simply because he committed violence somewhere else. But investigators were not trying to prove guilt through reputation. They were looking for connections, dates, locations, weapons, victims, patterns. And the first pattern was geographic. The Austin murders occurred in Texas. The other crimes associated with Brashers occurred in other states. The distances were enormous. But distance means very little to someone moving through the country. Highways erase boundaries. A person can leave one state in the morning and enter another before nightfall. In 1991, investigators could not instantly compare every unsolved homicide across the country. Today they can. That difference is enormous. The United States contains thousands of law enforcement agencies. For decades, many cases remained isolated inside local files. A murder in Texas might have no obvious connection to a murder in South Carolina. A weapon recovered in Missouri might have no obvious connection to a cartridge casing found in Austin. A biological profile might exist without a name. A name might exist without a DNA profile. The pieces could remain separated for years, until technology created bridges. The Austin case became one of those bridges. The cartridge casing was the first. The DNA was the second. And Brashers himself became the point where those lines appeared to converge. But there was something else investigators had to confront. The history of the 4 wrongfully accused men. That history was not simply an embarrassing footnote. It was central to understanding why the case had remained unresolved for so long. The original investigation had been under enormous pressure. 4 teenagers had been murdered. The community was terrified. The public wanted answers. And when investigators obtained confessions years later, the case seemed to have finally reached its conclusion. But confessions can be complicated. A suspect can lie. A suspect can repeat information heard from investigators. A suspect can become confused. A suspect can be pressured. And a confession that does not match physical evidence can become one of the most dangerous forms of certainty. The Austin case demonstrated that danger. When the biological evidence later excluded the men who had been prosecuted, the entire narrative began to collapse. The question became unavoidable. If they did not contribute the DNA, then whose DNA was it? For years, there was no answer. That unknown profile became almost like a second victim. It was present at the scene. It could not speak. It could not identify itself. It simply waited. The profile survived while investigators changed. Detectives retired. New detectives arrived. Laboratories upgraded their equipment. Databases expanded. And still the profile remained anonymous. Then came the search that finally produced a name. YSDR analysis connected the unknown male profile to Brasher's. That was the moment the cold case moved from an abstract mystery into something tangible. There was suddenly a person who had existed, a person who had traveled, a person who had possessed a firearm, a person whose history contained other violent crimes, and a person who was dead. That last fact changed the emotional weight of the discovery. Imagine spending decades asking who killed your daughter. Then, after 34 years, investigators call and say they believe they know. But the person is dead. You will never see him in court. You will never hear him speak. You will never watch him answer questions. You will never know whether he would have confessed. You will never know whether he would have denied everything. The truth arrives without the person who carried it. For families, that can be both relief and frustration. A name can close one door. It can also open 10 more. Why did he do it? Why did he choose the girls? Why did he burn the shop? What happened before the shooting? What happened afterward? Where did he go? What did he tell anyone? Did anyone help him? Did anyone suspect him? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, was Austin the only place where he left evidence? Investigators know that violent offenders can cross jurisdictional boundaries. That is why modern cold case work increasingly relies on information sharing. One agency may hold the weapon. Another may hold the DNA. A third may hold a photograph. A fourth may have an old traffic stop. A fifth may have a victim whose case was never solved. Individually, each agency sees a fragment. Together, they may see a pattern. The Austin investigation became an example of that principle. The cartridge casing created a link. The link led to another crime. The other crime led to Brasher's. The DNA connected Brasher's to the Austin evidence. The firearm connected Brasher's to the ballistic evidence. The timeline placed him in Texas immediately after the murders. The evidence was no longer moving randomly. It was converging. But even convergence has limits. Investigators still cannot reconstruct every minute of December 6th, 1991. That night remains fragmented. The girls entered the shop. At some point, the killer entered. At some point, the girls were restrained. At some point, they were shot. At some point, the fire was started. And eventually, the building burned. The exact order of every event cannot be recovered. The evidence tells investigators what happened. It does not always tell them exactly how it felt. That difference is important when telling a story about victims who were so young. Because the temptation in true crime is to focus on the killer, the suspect, the weapon, the mystery, the shocking revelation. But behind every forensic discovery are 4 human beings whose futures ended before they had really begun. Jennifer Harbison was 17. She had a sister. Sarah was 15. Eliza Thomas was 17. Amy Ayers was 13. The numbers are simple. Their lives were not. Each had a family, friends, routines, Favorite places. Plans. Ordinary teenage problems. The kind of problems that seem enormous at 17 and insignificant decades later. None of those girls knew they were living through the final hours of their lives. That is one of the cruelest features of violent crime. The victim rarely knows when the ordinary day has become the last day. There is no warning bell. No annoncement. No dramatic music. One moment is ordinary. The next becomes history. And for everyone left behind, history never stops. Birthdays become anniversaries. Anniversaries become reminders. Photographs become evidence of time passing. A 17-year-old remains 17 forever. A 15-year-old remains 15. A 13-year-old remains 13. Meanwhile, everyone else grows older. That is the hidden horror of a cold case. The world continues. The victim does not. The investigators continue. The suspect may not. The evidence waits. And decades disappear. The yogurt shop case survived those decades. It survived changing police departments, changing forensic techniques, changing legal standards, changing public attention. It survived wrongful convictions. It survived the death of one of the accused men. It survived the death of the suspected killer. And it survived the loss of the original crime scene itself. That last point is significant. The physical location no longer exists as it did that night. But the evidence did. The crime scene had become portable. It lived inside evidence bags, inside laboratory records, inside photographs, inside ballistic databases, inside DNA profiles, inside court transcripts. The building could disappear. The evidence could not. That is why the case could be reopened. The past had been preserved in pieces, and modern investigators knew how to assemble them. Still, every breakthrough raised another uncomfortable thought. What if the technology had arrived earlier? What if the cartridge casing had been entered into a national database decades ago? What if the YSDR profile had been matched sooner? What if investigators had understood the significance of the evidence in 1991? Would the wrong convictions have happened? Would the 4 men have spent years fighting to clear their names? Would the families have waited 34 years for a suspect's name? There is no way to answer those questions. History does not offer alternate timelines. It offers consequences. And the consequences of this case were enormous. For the victims' families. For the accused men. For investigators. For the Austin community. And for the criminal justice system itself. The case became a warning about the dangers of tunnel vision. Once investigators believe they have found the answer, every new piece of evidence can be interpreted through that belief. A statement becomes confirmation. A coincidence becomes proof. Contradictions become excuses. The investigation begins bending toward the suspect rather than following the evidence. That is why the later DNA exclusion was so important. The science did not care about the previous convictions. It did not care about the headlines. It did not care about public pressure. It simply asked a question. Who contributed this biological material? And the answer was not Springsteen, not Scott, not Pierce, not Wellborn. The evidence forced the investigation to look somewhere else. That was painful, but it was necessary. Because justice is not served by maintaining an old conclusion simply because too much time has been invested in it. Justice requires the courage to say, we were wrong, and then to start again. Austin had to start again. The cold case unit did exactly that. And the new investigation eventually found Brasher's. But the breakthrough did not erase the failures. It exposed them. The same case that eventually demonstrated the power of modern forensic science also demonstrated the consequences of investigative mistakes. That contradiction is what makes the yogurt shop murders so enduring. It is not simply a story about a killer who escaped. It is a story about evidence. It is a story about memory. It is a story about technology. It is a story about the danger of certainty. And above all, it is a story about 4 young women whose families refused to let the world forget them. Because if the families had stopped asking questions, perhaps the case would have remained buried. If investigators had stopped testing evidence, the DNA would have remained anonymous. If the cartridge casing had never been entered into knee bean, the ballistic connection might never have surfaced. If the laboratories had not revisited the old YSDR profile, Brasher's might never have been identified. Every breakthrough depended on someone refusing to accept that the past was unreachable. That is what cold case investigators do. They reopen doors that everyone else has stopped knocking on. They read reports written before they were born. They examine photographs of crime scenes that no longer exist. They speak with witnesses who have spent decades trying to forget. They handle evidence older than some of their colleagues. And they ask one question again and again. What did we miss? In Austin, the answer was devastating. They missed a man who had already crossed the country. They missed a firearm. They missed a ballistic connection. They missed a biological identity. And they missed the fact that the truth could survive even after the suspect died. But the evidence did not miss the girls. It remembered them. Every laboratory result carried the history of that night. Every ballistic comparison pointed back toward the crime scene. Every legal development forced the system to reconsider what it believed. And eventually, after 34 years, the investigation produced a name. Brasher's. The name arrived too late to change what happened, but not too late to change what the world believed. The 4 accused men were no longer the center of the story. The DNA had moved them out. The ballistics had moved the investigation elsewhere. The old case had been rewritten. Not erased. Rewritten. And that distinction matters. Because the truth about a cold case is rarely clean. There are no perfect endings. There are only stronger explanations. Better evidence. Fewer unanswered questions. And sometimes a name. The Austin yogurt shop murders now have one. But the night itself remains frozen. The doors. The counters. The lights. The empty street outside. The 4 girls inside. The approaching flames. The sirens. The firefighters. The investigators. The first photographs. The first questions. The first mistake. The years that followed. And finally, the evidence emerging from the ashes. 34 years is an almost impossible amount of time. But time did not erase the crime. It transformed the investigation. The evidence became older. The science became newer. And somewhere between those two things, the truth began to emerge. The killer could not be questioned. But his history could be examined. His DNA could be tested. His weapon could be traced. His movements could be reconstructed. His name could be placed beside the evidence. And for the first time, the darkness surrounding the case had a boundary. Not an ending. A boundary. Beyond that boundary were still questions. But inside it was something investigators had never had before. A coherent explanation. And somewhere in Austin, after decades of waiting, 4 names could finally be spoken without the shadow of the wrong men attached to them. Jennifer Harbison. Sarah Harbison. Eliza Thomas. Amy Ayers. Not suspects. Not evidence. Not headlines. Victims. For girls who went to work one Friday night. For girls whose lives were stolen. And 4 names that remained alive long enough for science to finally catch up with the man investigators believe took them. The fire consumed the shop. but it did not consume the evidence. The years bury the case, but they did not bury the truth. And the dead man who once believed he had disappeared into history left behind one thing he could never take back. A trail. A trail that crossed states. A trail that crossed decades. A trail that finally led back to him. And once investigators saw it, they could not unsee it. The name was no longer hidden. The gun was no longer just a gun. The DNA was no longer anonymous. The cartridge casing was no longer a forgotten fragment. Everything had become connected. And yet, one final mystery remained untouched. What happened in the moments before the fire? Because that is where the human story disappears. The evidence can tell us who investigators believe was responsible. It can tell us what weapons were involved. It can tell us where the biological evidence came from. But it cannot return the final conversation between four sisters and friends. It cannot tell us whether anyone screamed, whether anyone tried to run, whether anyone believed help was coming. Those moments belong only to the dead. And that is where the case remains forever incomplete. 34 years later, Austin finally had a suspect. The courts had finally cleared the men who should never have carried the blame. The science had finally spoken. But the silence inside that burned building remained. And perhaps that silence will always be the final witness. Because the fire destroyed the room. The killer destroyed 4 lives. The investigation destroyed years through mistakes. But the evidence survived them all. Waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for detectives. Waiting for the right database. Waiting for the right laboratory. Waiting for someone to ask one more question. And when that question was finally asked, the past answered with a name. The past answered with a name. But a name is not the same as a complete story. For 34 years, investigators have been searching for the person behind the fire, the gunshots, and the 4 deaths inside a small Austin yogurt shop. Now, they had a suspect. They had evidence that connected him to the crime scene. They had a firearm connection. They had a timeline. They had a genetic link. Yet the central mystery remained. What exactly happened that night? That question matters because the Austin yogurt shop murders were never just about identifying a killer. They were about reconstructing a sequence of events that had been deliberately shattered. The fire was part of that destruction. Whoever started it understood something basic. Fire destroys. Fire changes. Fire confuses. It can transform a room into a landscape of ash, smoke, water, broken glass, warped metal, and blackened surfaces. It can make investigators question what happened before they even know what they are looking at. But fire does not destroy everything. Sometimes it leaves behind the smallest witnesses. A fragment. A casing. A trace. A pattern. And sometimes, decades later, those fragments become louder than the flames ever were. The 4 girls had been inside the shop. At some point, the situation turned violent. They were restrained. They were shot. The building was set on fire. The perpetrator left. Then the officer saw the flames. By the time emergency crews arrived, the crime was already over. There was no one waiting to tell them what had happened. Only the aftermath. That meant investigators were forced to work backward. They had to reconstruct the crime from what remained. And every reconstruction contains uncertainty. What investigators know is not always what they believe. What they believe is not always what they can prove. That distinction became critical as the years passed. The original investigation produced suspects. The later investigation produced confessions. The courts produced convictions. Then forensic science challenged those convictions. And eventually, the same forensic science helped point toward Brasher's. It is almost as if the case moved through 3 different eras of American criminal investigation. The first era depended heavily on interviews, witness statements, confessions, and traditional forensic examination. The second era was dominated by courtroom battles and questions about whether the original investigation had gone too far. The third era belonged to modern forensic science. DNA, YSDR analysis, ballistic databases, cross-jurisdictional searches, digital records, the ability to revisit evidence that once appeared exhausted. The final breakthrough could not have happened in 1991. That does not mean investigators in 1991 did nothing. They worked with the tools available to them. They followed leads. They questioned people. They examined the crime scene. They searched for weapons. They tried to understand what happened. But criminal investigation is always limited by the technology and knowledge of its time. What appears inconclusive in one decade can become powerful evidence in another. That is exactly what happened here. The unknown male DNA profile was a perfect example. For years, it was simply an unidentified profile. No name. No match. No suspect. It could exclude people, but it could not identify the person who left it. That is frustrating for investigators. An exclusion can tell you who did not contribute the DNA. It cannot always tell you who did. The 4 men once prosecuted in the case were excluded. That was enormously important, but it did not solve the murders. It created another mystery. Who was the unknown man? The question remained open. Years became decades. Then the forensic landscape changed. YSDR testing became more sophisticated. Laboratories developed better methods. Databases expanded. Investigators became more comfortable searching old evidence against new records. And suddenly, the unknown profile had somewhere to go. Bracers. A dead man. That detail is easy to overlook, but it changes the entire emotional structure of the case. Imagine solving a murder and discovering the suspect died decades earlier. There is no confrontation. There is no arrest. There is no interrogation. There is no moment when detectives can say, "We know what you did." There is only the evidence. And the evidence has to carry the entire weight of the conclusion. For the families, that can feel incomplete. They waited for someone to answer. Instead, they received a forensic explanation, a laboratory report, a police announcement, a name belonging to someone who would never appear in court. But there is another side to that reality. The identification also freed the living from a burden they had carried for years. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, Maurice Pierce. Their names had been tied to the murders for decades. The legal system had accused them. 2 had been convicted. The public had known them through the case. And yet the physical evidence eventually told investigators something different. They were not the source of the unknown male DNA. Their lives had been altered by a crime they did not commit. That is why the February 2026 court declaration mattered. It did not bring the girls back. It did not punish the person investigators now believe responsible. But it formally separated the 4 men from the murders. For the first time, the legal record could say what the DNA had already been saying. The wrong men had been blamed. The real tragedy is that the correction took decades. Years that could not be returned. Years spent defending themselves. Years spent explaining. Years spent living under the shadow of 4 murdered girls. And the families of the victims had to endure another kind of uncertainty. They had been told that the case was solved, then told that it was not. They had watched convictions collapse. They had watched suspects disappear from the investigation. They had waited while the unknown DNA remained unidentified. Then, decades later, they received the name of a man who had been dead since the 20th century. It was justice without a courtroom, answers without a confession, closure without an ending. And perhaps that is why the case still feels unfinished. Because there is a difference between knowing who investigators believe committed a crime and knowing exactly why that person committed it. Motive remains one of the darkest, unanswered questions. The available evidence can establish connections. But motive is psychological. It lives inside the mind of the person who made the decision. And Brashers is no longer alive to explain himself. Did he enter the yogurt shop intending to kill? Was there another motive? Did the situation escalate? Was the fire intended to destroy evidence? Was it part of a larger plan? Those questions may never receive definitive answers. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the case so haunting. Investigators can reconstruct movements. They can trace weapons. They can identify biological material. They can establish timelines. But they cannot reconstruct intention with absolute certainty. That is the boundary between forensic science and human psychology. Science can tell you that a man was connected to a weapon. It can tell you that his genetic profile matches biological evidence. It can tell you that he was in the region. But it cannot always tell you what he was thinking when he walked through the door. And in this case, that missing piece is enormous. Because the four girls were not abstract victims. They were individuals. Jennifer had 17 years of life behind her. Sarah had 15. Eliza had 17. Amy had 13. The numbers are devastating because they represent unfinished lives. 13 is not supposed to be the end. 15 is not supposed to be the end. 17 is not supposed to be the end. There should have been school, friends, family gatherings, graduations, jobs, relationships, ordinary mistakes, ordinary victories, ordinary mornings. The girls should have grown older. Instead, everyone else did. That is the strange cruelty of murder. The victim remains fixed in time. The world keeps moving. Austin changed. Technology changed. The people investigating the case changed. The legal system changed. Even the language used to describe forensic evidence changed. But the girls remained exactly as they were on that night. Forever teenagers. Forever remembered at the age when their lives stopped. And that is why every forensic breakthrough ultimately leads back to the victims. The evidence is not important because it is technically impressive. It is important because it gives their families something that had been missing. A direction. A name. An explanation. Even an incomplete explanation is different from silence. For decades, the silence was almost absolute. There was no definitive suspect. The men once convicted had been cleared. The unknown DNA profile had no identity. The cartridge casing had no obvious story. The firearm had not yet been connected to Austin in a way that could close the gap. Then the pieces began moving. The knee being hit. The Greenville connection. The YSDR match. The South Carolina laboratory. The Border Patrol record. The firearm. The serial number. One piece reinforced another. This is what investigators mean when they talk about corroboration. A single clue can mislead. Multiple independent clues pointing in the same direction are different. The casing alone might produce a lead. The DNA alone might produce a lead. The timeline alone might produce a lead. But when they intersect, the lead becomes far more significant. The past begins to look organized. And that organization is what makes the Brashers theory so powerful. Still, there's a painful irony. The evidence that ultimately helped identify the suspected killer also exposed the weakness of the earlier investigation. The science that cleared the four men was the same science that moved investigators toward Brashers. That means the case became a lesson in both failure and progress. The failure was believing that a confession and a conviction could substitute for physical evidence. The progress was learning to let physical evidence challenge what investigators thought they knew. That lesson extends far beyond Austin. Across the country, cold cases have been reopened because old evidence was tested again. Some have produced new suspects. Some have produced exonerations. Some have produced both. A single biological sample can overturn decades of assumptions. A single firearm can connect crimes separated by hundreds of miles. A single database search can transform an anonymous fragment into a name. But none of that is automatic. Someone has to decide to look. Someone has to request the testing. Someone has to preserve the evidence long enough for the future to examine it. And someone has to be willing to accept whatever answer emerges, even when that answer contradicts the story everyone believed. That is perhaps the greatest lesson of a yogurt shop case. The truth does not care how long an investigation has been running. It does not care how many people have already been convicted. It does not care how famous a case has become. If the evidence says the story is wrong, the story has to change. For 34 years, the story changed repeatedly. First, there was the unknown killer. Then the teenage suspects. Then the confessions. Then the convictions. Then the DNA exclusions. Then the unknown male profile. Then the ballistic connection. Then the YSDR match. Then Brasher's. Each stage replaced part of the previous story. But one thing never changed. 4 girls were murdered. That remained the center. Everything else was interpretation. The names of suspects. The theories. The court decisions. The laboratory results. The investigative strategies. All of it surrounded those 4 lives. And now, after decades, investigators could finally look at the case from a different angle. Not through the eyes of the men once accused. Not through the pressure of the original investigation, but through the physical evidence. The evidence had no memory of the headlines. It had no loyalty to a theory. It did not care about public opinion. It simply existed. A casing was fired. DNA was left behind. A weapon moved across state lines. A suspect appeared in another investigation. And decades later, modern science connected the pieces. That is why the most powerful image in this entire case may not be the burning building. It may be something much smaller. A tiny cartridge casing. Cold. Metallic. Forgotten. Sitting inside evidence storage for years. No one looking at it could hear the gunshot. No one could see the person who fired the weapon. No one could know where the casing would eventually lead. But it carried a record. A microscopic record. A record that survived the fire. Survived the water. Survived the investigation. Survived the courtroom. Survived the passage of time. And eventually it spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly enough for the right technology to understand. That is the strange power of forensic evidence. It can outlive everyone involved. The victim. The investigator. The suspect. The witness. The prosecutor. The defense attorney. Even the crime scene itself. The evidence can remain. And if it remains long enough, the future may be able to read it. 34 years after the murders, Austin finally had that future. But the future could not rewrite the past. It could only explain a small part of it. The families would still carry the loss. The exonerated men would still carry the years. The investigators would still carry the knowledge of what went wrong. And the suspect would remain beyond the reach of the courtroom. That is not the ending people expect from a murder investigation. There is no final door closing. No judge delivering a sentence. No jury returning a verdict. Instead, there is an empty space where the suspect should have been. And inside that space is a name. Robert Eugene Brasher's. A name recovered from DNA. A name supported by ballistic evidence. A name connected to a timeline. A name belonging to a man who died before the investigation could catch up with him. Perhaps that is the cruelest irony. For years, the families waited for the killer to be found. The killer died. The evidence survived. And eventually, the evidence found him anyway. The city did not get a trial, but it got a direction. The families did not get a confession, but they got a name. The 4 accused men did not get back the years they lost, but they got their innocence formally recognized. And the case, once buried beneath layers of uncertainty, finally had a forensic foundation strong enough to change its history. Still, when the headlines fade, the same question remains. What do you do with a truth that arrives 34 years too late? There is no simple answer. You remember. You document. You correct the record. You say the victims' names. You acknowledge the mistakes. You preserve the evidence. And you keep looking. Because the lesson of this case is not that every cold case can be solved. It is that a case should never be considered truly dead while meaningful evidence remains. The investigators of 1991 could not know what investigators of 2025 would have. The detectives who stood in that burned building could not imagine a national ballistic database connecting their cartridge casing to another murder thousands of miles away. They could not imagine a laboratory producing a genetic profile that would remain useful for decades. They could not imagine a future in which a dead man's DNA would finally give a forgotten clue a name. But that future arrived. And when it did, the past opened again. The fire was no longer simply a symbol of destruction. It became the beginning of a forensic trail. The cartridge was no longer just evidence. It became a bridge. The DNA was no longer just an unknown profile. It became an identity. The 4 accused men were no longer suspects. They became exonerated men. And the dead suspect was no longer simply another name in a criminal history. He became a man investigators believed the evidence had been pointing toward all along. 34 years. That is how long the answer waited. Not because the evidence disappeared, because the world had not yet learned how to read it. And somewhere inside that realization is the final tragedy of the Austin yogurt shop murders. The truth may have been present from the beginning. The world simply needed 34 years to hear it.